I know.
Especially in the first grade.
Yeah. How do you, one thing to think about is how you pick a price for the course, and how, is there any, how do you adapt the price over time? Is there the maximum price, or it seems like it's a fixed price, not a maximum price, but a set price?
Yes, so that's one of the decisions the state has to make. There's actually several factors. I have a slide we can go through real quick. So the most basic model that we have is if we wanted to use existing funding that's going to schools, so you don't have to allocate any additional funding for the online courses, which is what a lot of states are trying to do. Then you have per pupil funding that's going to these schools. And every student gets a certain amount of funding, and then you divide that by the number of courses they're teaching. So say there's $1,000, and you have 5 courses the student is supposed to take a semester, then that's $200 per course, right? But there's other things you have to take into account, that maybe a calculus class takes a lot more to teach than, say, PE. So in a brick and mortar school, this all comes out in the wash. But when you're dealing with these online courses, that's not going to happen because they're happening with individual providers. So a lot of states have tiered systems. So a math class will be allocated maybe that full $200, but a class like history might only get $150. That would be available for the online providers. In addition to that, there's also administrative costs that the districts worry about. And that's really what a stumbling block is for districts playing along, is that, in theory, if the student wasn't taking any courses at that district, the district would still have costs that it has to pay. So we recommend that you set aside a certain chunk of that $200 that the district would receive regardless of the student taking an online course or not. That would then incentivize the district to play along more. And again, you could also, if you wanted to, allocate more savings into that, either to incentivize the district more, or for the state to keep. If you think that an online course really isn't worth $200, it really is only worth $100, and those savings should be going to the state.
Was there some way to then say, look at, you've said we're going to give $80 for this course, and you get 27 different firms that are willing to do it for $80. You go, gee, maybe you were paying too much. Is there any way to get pressure to say, well, we can reduce the cost somehow?
Well, in theory, the cost would be...
If the cost would be fixed at $80, you don't have any incentive to bid below 80.
Right.
In this model.
But you would have the incentive to bid the highest incentive pay possible, which is not guaranteed. In fact, if you have all providers can't receive 100% of the incentive base, and some of it is competitive. So in theory, unless you have one provider who's doing outstandingly and teaching every student and they're mastering every course every year after year, which maybe is worth $80, that would be a problem then. But in theory, otherwise, the incentive pay bids would increase savings no matter what. So that price might be different for each course provider that they're paying. But in theory, it wouldn't. The competition would still exist to drive the price down.
So this is a very technical piece, comment on the auction thing that you guys should think about is whether you showed that one of the winners was at 60%, one was at 70%. Whether or not it's a pay as bid auction or whether you get paid what you bid or you get paid the marginal bidder. And that makes a big difference in incentives and how you bid. So you need to think about that as well.
In this case, the marginal bidder would be the lower incentive pay, the 60%.
Yes, the lower incentive pay is the marginal bidder, and then they would all get the same marginal in that case. I think that might be the better way, but you should think about what, there's a big difference in bidding strategy and how firms might react to that depending on what the rules are. Only auction nerds would think of that, sorry.
And that is that you might actually get higher incentive pay bids if everybody gets the marginal bid rather than what they bid.
Yeah, you would give a more truthful revelation of what their preferences are.
Yes.
I have quite a few questions, and let me ask the first one. You didn't say anything about numbers of pupils taking the course. I assume the marginal cost of an extra pupil is zero once the course has been designed, but if you're going to pay people a basic amount, then it's going to have to cover the cost of the quality of preparation, and you're assuming that would be the same for one as for 10,000 students taking the course?
Do you know about Adeeb enrollment?
I don't think I understood the question. The question is that if...
Is there any relationship at all between the preparation costs for the course and the number of students who will be taking the course? I mean, it's going to be harder to administer. For example, you're going to be doing something to grade tests, or you're going to be doing all sorts of things. I mean, you've got the fixed cost of producing the course, but then there may be variable costs that are associated with the number of students that are interacting with have you given any thought to that at all?
Yeah, so this question kind of relates to online education being a very new industry, and our hope is that we'll get up to 8 course providers to even, selective course providers, quality course providers to participate in the beginning. But we suspect that since students don't really take online education as commonly as they go to brick and mortar schools, that for the first contract period of 3 years, or maybe 2 or 3 contract periods, there won't be an overflow of students who are signing up for online classes. Now, our model being malleable to, the amount of base pay that online course providers think they're worth, and being flexible to states making different decisions at each major decision point in the model, allows for course providers to bid higher numbers over time as the number of students increase. So we'd expect that phenomenon to occur, that as more and more students start to enroll in the classes, then course providers do believe that their base pay should be higher to cover those increasing variable costs, and that's going to happen across the board as there's a larger pool of students that enter the online education industry. But
I think Nick's question was a little different, which is you have a fixed. If I'm going to do an algebra class, it's going to cost me $100,000 to get the course up and running, and it might cost me $10 a student. But and so I'm not going to be willing to do it unless I get $100,000 in fees from you guys. And if only 1,000 students sign up, then at $100 a piece, I'm okay. But if 10,000 students sign up, I'm in great shape. But there's a question: is there a way to bid something that gives you a fixed fee plus?
Yeah, Greg's picked up on it. When I used to do some of this in distance learning stuff, and the general, at the time ground stations were expensive, but they were cheaper than content. Because once you had the content, you could put it through all the ground stations. But it was about $100,000 an hour to produce what people thought of as high quality content. I remember this was in Indonesia, but still. If you're going to keep people's interest for an hour and provide high quality stuff, it tends to be costly. So you're not going to commit to doing this unless you know that if I'm going to be paid some lump sum that's going to cover my development costs. It's a bit like in a sense, an electricity pricing policy. I'm going to get a demand cost for simply providing the service. And then, in addition, as people use the service, I get paid some part of the, what I need to incentivize me to accept more kids rather than fewer. But the way it's presented, I think it's a very simplified pricing model, and I don't know whether in practice you can do that. But let me go on, because I don't want to belabor this. I'm taking too much of your time. The second question I'd asked as we went whether or not there was independent assessment. And the suggestion was there would be, so that we'd be teaching a course, somebody else would be evaluating student performances. This then relates to the notion, somebody said as you gave your presentation, the students would determine which was the better experience or which was the better course. So they would give their weighting. Now what if I thought the course was awful, but I actually improved my academic performance hugely? They didn't like the course. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
well, as part of that process, when students talk, let's take a brick and mortar school for example. When students talk about what the most popular classes are, it doesn't stop at was it a fun class. It extends to did you do well? Do you feel like it prepared you after, for your graduation? Do you feel like it helped you get a job? Did you feel like you made good connections?
Immediately after they finish the class, after they get the exam results, 6 months later when they see how they do in the next course that builds on the work that they did in that course.
We assumed at the end of the school year, so that we could base our evaluation process at the end of 3 years on those 3 years of assessments.
So let me ask the final question, which is probably a bit fair in some ways, but perhaps not so fair in others. In a public policy problem, all the time is, what are the unintended consequences? What could go wrong? What have you thought about that could really go wrong, so that you'd invest in a model like this and then find all sorts of issues that come up that make it actually perform rather badly?
Well, one issue is that, as Paige mentioned towards the end of the presentation, the top 2 performing online providers will be renewed for the next contract period. And if we have 8 online providers in algebra and only the top 2 renew, then maybe the 3rd and 4th were also really great providers. Then in the next contract period of 3 years, they're at risk, although they have the same playing field as the other providers and can bid for a low base pay, they're at risk of being on the outside looking in essentially for the next contract period.
So if you do a Hall of Fame type thing, if you get 70% of the votes, then you get renewed and not go with 2. And so, if you achieve a certain threshold, then the question is, what do you do when nobody achieves the threshold?
It also goes back to the flexibility of the model, and we thought that the top 2 performing online providers was a good number. The state can decide that maybe in courses like math, where their students are doing well year after year, that if 4 course providers show that they're distinguish themselves from the other providers, then maybe in that particular subject the top 4 get renewed. So it's a decision that the state can make.
But your model works if you instead don't fix the number of automatic winners, but set a threshold and say everyone who exceeds this threshold.
That's another option.
Right.
I mean, there's all sorts of things you can think of. I mean, how can you ensure there won't be abuse? In the sense that certain, whether it's the district, whether it's the state, that certain people at the top favour providers in some way, so that they get the Guernsey, they can get permitted to provide the course.
I think there'll just have to be a lot of transparency about the assessment.
Exactly right. Yeah. So
process.
how do we ensure that the transparency is there from the get-go? What sorts of governance process and of the selection?
I think that in probably back when we were talking about where the providers are getting narrowed down, we would have to provide the providers with, here are the criteria you're going to be assessed on, please design your courses accordingly. And so that way they're not caught blindsided, essentially.
Too much in me.
I want to start by saying that it was also a very good presentation and also really good speaking skills. And it's not all, I don't know,
They're just naturally gifted.
It's impressive.
And they worked hard.
Yeah, and everyone looks really nice too. I didn't recognize one of the students. It's really good.
She won't say which one.
Yeah. No, yeah. Okay. And I want to say for both projects too, you all it wasn't just the speaking, but also really organized, and the slides, like you mentioned, really clear, not tons of text. I think figures, we love it when you mix up, the text and the figures. You all did that. The other team really appreciated it when you had your really kind of scary matrix, and then you showed the synthesis and where it was in the condensed matrix, which was great. I also really like these photos at the end. Where does this come from? I've never seen this before. Is that Keith? And are there their names or their parts?
I think on one of them we had names and the other one
Yeah, it was
just
very interesting.
This one didn't have names.
Because I was like, oh no, what's this person's name? Oh, Medicare Connection. Yeah. Anyway, but that was great. Okay, so I have some different questions, and I should say there was a Practicum team that did a project last winter on online courses. I don't know if you all saw it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I was supervising that project, and one thing that came out is there's so much variation. There's variation in the types of students who would take it. Is it homeschooled? Are they going to be working with the district? Is this students that are taking it on the weekend to get ahead of their peers and things like that? Also the subject matter. What types do you recommend that the states focus on? Hard skills or math classes first, and then some of these more elective courses, later, because it might be that it's easier to assess math tests versus other ones. So I was wondering if you thought some about that, and then a third thing was about cheating, and if you had, that's an issue that comes up as well in online courses, and if you thought of any about that, some of this variation and how the state might deal with that, with the classes, with who takes them, and then just throw in the cheating.
We thought less about those variables because our client was more focused on switching from a pay-for-service model to a pay-for-performance model, and he wasn't as concerned about the nitty-gritty what's happening with these online courses. But we did, in every conversation with online providers or students or administrators, come into contact with those types of problems. Cheating, we didn't give much thought to. I think that's just something that exists in schools today, and it exists online as well. And you know, it's sort of a function of where you are and who you are.
There's
How
new
do you sign the honor
technologies.
code?
Yeah, right. There are some, I think there are some different ways that
There's
some online
technologies.
companies
We
are
read
trying.
about-
Yeah, and
So
and
states
there's
could like
new
require
developments
that
that
they
are
use something like that, or
coming out which should address hopefully some of that. What was the site, in addition to cheating?
the different types of classes.
And
Assessing, things like math are definitely easier, and that's something where when we were talking to states about whether they could come up with their own types of assessments, they said there aren't really great assessments for classes like things in visual arts. So Utah is dealing with that, Louisiana is dealing with that, every state that has looked into implementing online courses, they're all coming up with different ways to evaluate those courses that are less quantitative, but it's true that even today, there really is no standardized best practice for doing that.
And one final point on that is that a lot of states are putting limits when they pass legislation. So saying, for example, a student can take up to 2 courses in only these 3 subjects, and that would possibly address both that concern as well as the bulk concern, because if you say it's only in, you know, math classes and English language arts, then you're almost guaranteed a very wide, you know, possible base of students that you could appeal your course to as well.
Okay. And then about the students, so I see district, no involvement unless mandated by state law. Greg has on his teachers, teacher unions, you know, political issues. At one point you said, you know, right now most people take classes in brick and mortar, but, you know, maybe in the future, I don't know, are some states thinking that these online courses are going to be serving different subpopulations. It's going to stay at, you know, a limited number that can't access certain classes for various reasons, or homeschooled students, or is it also students that, you know, can't. I know there was some cases where some districts, they just can't offer some the higher level courses, and so they like, and they can even take the courses, I think, in the brick and mortar classrooms.
I think that the key, like, political buzzword is supplemental, and that's sort of is what most states are doing right now. So that word sort of calms the teachers' unions, I think, somewhat, and the main idea is, at least the target populations of students right now are, you know, students living in places where a computer science class isn't taught, and they want to be able to supplement their other classes and take it online, or they just prefer to learn online. They know from experience with groups of students like that, I think, are the target. So it's not, I mean, there is a political reality that teachers' unions, I think, are going to be opposed to this, because ultimately less students in brick and mortar schools means less demand for teachers. But that's something our model hasn't extended to at this point, because this was mostly just the pricing stuff.
I was just wondering, with this setup, would there be funding set aside for computers to be used at the schools, or would the students be expected to have their own technology?
Yeah, so access is another one.
Access is definitely an issue, and I think that also depends on the course offered. So you could, for example, have a blended learning type course where there's also perhaps an in-person component that might change it. Again, that's definitely a problem right now, but we're anticipating this is a forward-looking model, and as we look forward, that'll become less and less of a problem as time goes on, hopefully. But we thought about that a little bit, and there's not really much we can do as far as our model goes from top down to force districts to buy additional computers for this. But that could be potentially something that the savings in the model goes towards, is technology upgrades.
Yeah, and then again, the built-in savings also could go towards, I mean, the state could use them any way they want, but higher salaries for teachers and other things that benefit brick and mortar schools. So that sort of would be the pitch of how we would be able to sell it. That would be the idea.
Can I ask 2 questions? One sort of follows up on the question about the keeping 2 out of the 8 providers, which I think is alarming because you're going to have such high turnover. You're not going to have a bank of people who have knowledge, and the new people will always have to come up to speed, learn the material, maybe learn how to do course providing. So I think I'm a little concerned about that, but that turnover is based upon the assessment, and a key component of that seems to be growth, right? So Kyle, you mentioned middling growth versus high growth. So how are you recommending that people measure that? And so that does tie into also the question of how do you, a quantitative versus a qualitative course, like you mentioned PE or history. But how are you going to measure growth?
So that's something that we cover extensively in the paper, are what are some of the existing growth assessments out there, what are the limitations of those, of which there are a lot right now. It's growth metrics weren't even something that was really on the table or talked about a lot 5-10 years ago. So a lot of these are developing, and they're more mature and advanced in subjects like math, like we talked about earlier, where it's more easy to measure that. So that's another consideration to take into account. So the growth assessments, that's a technology that's advancing, and we didn't want to be too prescriptive of what exactly type growth assessment or where to make the cutoffs for high versus moderate versus low growth and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then in relation to the turnover you were talking about, it's not that the people who don't make the top 2 can't compete again. So all those people will still have all of the data on their assessment and their previous experience offering a course. So and they can but they still have to go back through the application process with the state. Is the idea.
I was also wondering if 2 can necessarily meet the demand as well in some states. I don't know.
Yeah. Again, it's like our model's designed to be flexible to the needs of the state. So yeah.
It would be 2 and then plus 6.
Yeah.
2 would be renewed, and then the remaining 6 spots of the 8 course providers would be open to auction. So it'd be a total of 8.
But in 3 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
after the
year
first 3
2,
years, in year 2, the same 8 providers who made it through the auction successfully compete or offer courses. Same in year 3. Year 4, you have a new auction, and the top 2 providers pass through that automatically, get renewals of their contracts. The other 6 have to rebid in the auction with another pool of competitors.
Okay.
It's like getting a bye in the first round of the US Open.
Right. Okay. I didn't know. Okay.
Oh, that makes much more sense.
2 other questions. One is you could talk a little bit more about your sources. It sounds like you interviewed some people and various sources, and then also about your client and how your client is planning to use this information. And I should also say, both projects, I think your clients are going to find the information really, really useful, and you all have done a lot of great research and pulling it together and analysis, and so that's great.
We presented this morning to our client.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How did it go?
Yeah.
Well, went really well.
Right.
Yeah.
So I emailed John, how did they do? He was going to write you fantastic. They actually came up with 2 concepts, the auction and the scorecard incentive payment system that no one else has thought of before, just the out-of-the-box thinking I was hoping for. My only ask was for the report to have a crisp 2-page summary that could boil their process into 3 or 4 steps so it could be sellable. But in all seriousness, Keith, they have a few ideas in there that I'd like to try and pitch to some policymakers.
Great.
I think that should be the last comment.
So why don't we finish there? Thank you. Good job.